The river at dawn looked harmless, almost shy, its skin pale as milk glass under the first light, yet everyone in Red Willow knew how it swallowed secrets whole. Leotai Hawkridge stood at its edge with her shawl pulled tight, listening to the water speak in a language older than blame. The reeds whispered against one another as if trading rumors, and the air carried that cold, clean smell that comes before memory hurts. She had learned to arrive early, before eyes followed her shape and decided what story to tell. Still, the river watched her back, patient and knowing, as if it remembered something the town pretended to forget. They said she was not suitable for anyone, and the words clung like burrs to her hem no matter how carefully she walked. At 22, Leotai carried a widow's shadow without having earned the years to explain it. 1 week married, 7 mornings of learning another person's breathing, and then the 8th day delivered her back to silence. Her husband had gone fishing with a laugh still warm on his mouth, and by dusk the river returned him cold and emptied of future. When grief staggered her, the town steadied itself by pointing, because fear prefers a face. She learned then how a lie repeated gently can pass for truth, and she bowed her head so no one would see her swallow it. Red Willow survived on small mercies and smaller cruelties, both traded at the same counter. Martha Bell's voice traveled fastest, soft as sugar and sharp as glass, telling anyone who would listen that misfortune followed Leotai like a loyal dog. Old Eli Redfern swore he saw the water twist that day as if summoned, and his certainty became a cornerstone for other people's comfort. The sheriff, Amos Blackwell, never said the word cursed, but he did not say its opposite either, and silence did the rest. Leotai found herself shrinking, careful with joy, rationing hope as though it were winter flour. If disaster loved her company, she reasoned, the kindest thing was to be alone, though the thought left a hollow ache that would not name itself. She moved through her days like a guest who planned to leave before dessert, mending nets for coin, trading herbs for bread, keeping her voice low enough to avoid echoes. At night she dreamed of water pressing against her ribs, not drowning but waiting, as if asking a question she was afraid to answer. Each morning she told herself she deserved the quiet, that this was penance shaped like peace. Yet even in stillness, something restless stirred, a curiosity she refused to entertain. What if the story was wrong and she had simply been unlucky, a thought she pushed away as the sun climbed higher. It was on one such morning that a horse stopped behind her, close enough to warm the air, far enough not to startle. Hanska Cole dismounted without hurry, his boots leaving careful prints in the damp soil. He was 30, with a face weathered into kindness by wind and work, the sort of man who looked like he belonged to wide spaces. He did not greet her with a question, did not demand an explanation for her solitude. Instead, he picked up the scarf the breeze had stolen from her shoulders and held it out as if returning a borrowed word. Their eyes met briefly, and in that small exchange, Leotai felt the ground settle. Hanska had heard the stories, of course. A man cannot live in Red Willow without learning which names to avoid. But rumor never sat comfortably on his tongue, and he preferred evidence to echoes. He had come to the river to check a fence line after the last storm, and he lingered because the quiet asked him to. When he spoke, it was only to remark on the water's mood, how it ran lower after summer heat, as if sharing an observation rather than a judgment. Leotai answered with a nod, surprised by how easy it felt to breathe. Neither of them noticed the way time loosened its grip, as if curious to see what would happen next. Days found excuses to cross their paths, simple errands that felt chosen. Hanska offered work mending rails near his ranch, nothing that demanded her presence, only an invitation with room to refuse. Leotai accepted because hunger argues well, and because something in his stillness felt safe, though she did not trust the feeling yet. At the ranch, the land opened wide, grass humming with insects, the barn smelling of hay and old patience. Hanska worked alongside her, never ahead, never behind, and when silence settled it did not accuse. In the space between hammer strikes, Leotai felt a careful warmth, like a fire banked low, asking permission to burn. Their connection grew the way good things do in dry country, slow, attentive, grateful for small rains. He noticed when her hands trembled near the water trough and moved without comment to take the heavier bucket. She learned the shape of his mornings, the way he paused to listen before speaking, as if words were guests worth seating properly. Once, a laugh escaped her before she could stop it, bright and startled, and the sound frightened her with its promise. Hanska looked up, eyes soft, and returned to his work, giving the moment room to land. That night, Leotai lay awake wondering when joy had become something she feared, and what it might cost to welcome it back. The town noticed because towns always do. Martha Bell's concern bloomed again, warning Hanska that kindness could be dangerous, that rivers remember names. Sheriff Blackwell rode out one afternoon under the guise of checking fences, his voice gentle, his caution practiced. Hanska listened, thanked him, and did nothing differently, which unsettled people more than anger would have. Leotai heard the whispers at the market, felt them trail her like dust, and the old shame rose obediently to its feet. She packed her few things that evening, telling herself departure was mercy, that love was a debt she could not pay. A storm gathered as if summoned by her decision, clouds stacking their dark intentions over the hills. Wind worried the trees and the river grew louder, impatient. Hanska was late returning from the far pasture, and when his horse spooked near the bank, the world tipped. Leotai ran when she saw him fall, the water surging around his boots, the past pressing hard against her chest. For a breathless moment, the town's story reached for her throat, urging her to freeze, to let the river have what it wanted. Instead, she stepped forward, hands burning cold, choosing motion over myth. Time slowed the way it does when courage arrives unannounced. Leotai felt the river's pull and answered with her weight, with a grip learned from nets and necessity. Hanska's eyes found hers, steady even as the current argued, and together they found a rhythm that the water could not break. When they stumbled onto the bank, breath ragged and alive, the storm seemed to reconsider its plans. The townsfolk who had followed stood silent, their certainty rinsed thin. The river slid back into itself, carrying away a lie it had never owned. Recovery came quietly as good things often do. Hanska healed with patience, Leotai stayed without apology, and the days learned a new arrangement. No one spoke of curses aloud anymore, and when they did, the words fell flat as if the air refused them. Leotai found herself standing taller, meeting her reflection without flinching, learning that survival could look like grace. The river remained, honest and indifferent, a witness rather than a judge. Together they did not name what they were building, trusting that some truths prefer to be lived before they are spoken. If you are listening from your own distance, carrying a story that was handed to you and called fate, consider this a gentle interruption. Shame often arrives dressed as wisdom, telling us to disappear for the comfort of others. But there are moments, small, bright, terrifying, when stepping forward rewrites the ending without asking permission. Leotai did not conquer the river, she refused the lie that claimed her name. And somewhere between fear and motion, a different future learned to breathe, waiting to see if you will recognize it too. The days after the storm unfolded with a careful tenderness, as if the world itself had learned restraint. Hanska moved slower now, favoring his ribs, but his eyes carried a steadier light, one that followed Leotai without asking her to account for it. She cooked while he rested, the small cabin filling with the scent of cornbread and simmered beans, ordinary smells that felt almost holy. Outside, the land drank deeply from the rain, grass bending under new weight, and Leotai wondered if people could do the same, accept nourishment without suspicion. Each quiet hour asked a question she was only beginning to answer. Word spread through Red Willow not as fire this time but as thaw. Folks nodded when Leotai passed, their gazes lingering with a curiosity softened by doubt. Some looked away, embarrassed by their earlier certainty, while others studied her as if searching for proof that the river had truly loosened its grip. Martha Bell grew careful with her voice, and old Eli stopped telling his story halfway through, unsure where conviction now belonged. The sheriff tipped his hat more often, a small gesture heavy with meaning. Leotai felt the weight of eyes lessening, though habit made her brace all the same, unsure how long grace could last. Hanska never spoke of that day by the river, not because it frightened him, but because he understood that naming it might steal its power. Instead, he fixed a broken gate, counted cattle, and let his presence say what words might have rushed. One evening, as the sun slid low and painted the fields in copper, he handed Leotai a length of twine and asked for help mending a fence line that had been neglected too long. They worked side by side, fingers brushing now and then, the contact brief but intentional, like punctuation in a sentence neither was ready to finish. The air hummed with unspoken things, and Leotai felt herself leaning toward them despite the old fears stirring awake. At night, she returned to her cabin less often, lingering by Hanska's fire instead, listening to the pop of wood and the steady rhythm of his breathing. She spoke of her mother once, of songs sung in a language she only half remembered, and Hanska listened as if the words were gifts. He told her about the loneliness of wide land, how silence can echo louder than noise, and Leotai recognized herself in his confession. Their stories braided together gently, not to bind but to strengthen, and she sensed a new shape forming, fragile and resilient at once. Still, a question hovered at the edge of comfort. asking how much happiness one person was allowed to claim. The river ran lower as summer leaned in, its voice calmer, almost companionable. Leotai found herself walking its banks again, not in mourning but in conversation, tracing the water's edge with her shadow. She spoke to it once, softly, telling it she would not carry its blame anymore, and felt foolish and lighter for having said it aloud. When Hanska joined her, he did not ask what she had told the water, only stood close enough to share the breeze. The river slipped past them, unconcerned, and Leotai took that as permission. Yet peace, once tasted, has a way of revealing what still aches. One afternoon, a traveling preacher stopped in town, his voice sharp with certainty, stirring old fears with borrowed scripture. He spoke of judgment and signs, of sins that stain families and futures alike, and Leotai felt the familiar tightening in her chest. The crowd murmured, some nodding, some uneasy, and she realized how thin acceptance could be when tested. Hanska reached for her hand then, openly, before witnesses and doubt, and did not let go when eyes turned. The gesture cost him something, she knew, and that knowledge settled deep, heavy with gratitude and resolve. The preacher left without triumph, and the town returned to its routines, but something had shifted again, subtle and irreversible. Leotai understood now that dignity was not granted, it was practiced, sometimes daily, sometimes with trembling hands. She began helping more openly, offering herbs to those who once avoided her, mending clothes without charge, meeting suspicion with steadiness. Some kindness was returned, some not, but she learned that her worth did not hinge on the outcome. Hanska watched this unfolding with quiet pride, seeing not a miracle but a woman choosing herself. One evening, as the cicadas sang their relentless chorus, Hanska asked if she would stay through winter, the question framed as practical concern, not promise. Leotai considered the seasons ahead, the cold mornings, the shared labor, the slow trust that might deepen or falter. She thought of the river, of fear faced and survived, of a life no longer defined by retreat. When she nodded, the simple motion felt like crossing a threshold, small yet profound. Hanska smiled then, a smile that carried no triumph, only welcome, and the night seemed to lean closer to listen. They did not rush the shape of what came next. Days layered upon days, building something sturdy enough to hold silence and song alike. Leotai learned that love could be spacious, leaving room for memory without being ruled by it. Hanska learned that companionship did not shrink a man's world but gave it depth. Together they found a rhythm that matched the land's own, patient and enduring. Still, the future remained unwritten, its pages blank and inviting, and that uncertainty no longer felt like a threat. If this story is still unfolding for you, it is because life rarely closes its doors with a final sound. Healing continues in quiet choices, in hands offered and accepted, in the courage to remain when leaving would be easier. Leiotai's path did not end with rescue or renown, but with something gentler and more demanding, a commitment to live without the weight of a lie. As the river keeps moving, so does she, and somewhere ahead, another dawn waits, ready to ask what you will choose when the old stories loosen their hold.